There is a particular kind of silence that only parents understand. It lives in the space between who you are and who the world sees, and it settles into you so quietly that most days you don't even notice it's there. You have carried it for years. You have made peace with it. You tell yourself that the reward was never recognition. It was the child himself, the life you shaped, the person you made possible. And most days, you believe that. Then one day your son stands at a microphone in front of 200 people wearing his best hired suit, and he says the words that cut through every single one of those peaceful years, like a knife through paper. I want to tell you about Margaret Chen. I want to tell you about what she built and what was taken, and how she got it back. Because this story is not really about revenge. It is about documentation. It is about the quiet, devastating power of a woman who kept her receipts when everyone around her assumed she would just absorb the pain and be grateful. She was 52 years old on the day her life changed, and before we get to the hotel ballroom, before we get to the applause that she could not bring herself to join, you need to understand what those years actually looked like. Not in the abstract, in the specific. In the particular texture of ordinary sacrifice that most people never see until the moment it stops being invisible. Because Margaret's story did not begin at a wedding. It began on a Tuesday morning in Shawlands when a 6-month-old baby was left with her, and a woman walked out a door and did not come back for 17.5 years. Act 1. Glasgow in late autumn has a specific quality to it that people who have never lived there cannot quite imagine. The light comes in sideways and gray, filtering through cloud cover that seems permanent from October onward, and the city itself seems to pull inward, streets narrowing under it, sandstone darkening with damp. There is beauty in it, but it is not a forgiving beauty. It is the kind of beauty that asks something of you. Margaret Chen had lived in the Shawlands flat for 19 years by the time of the wedding. She had moved there at 33 with a baby and a set of second-hand furniture, and the particular determination of a woman who has decided that this, right here, is where she makes her stand. The flat was on a quiet street off Pollokshaws Road, 3 stories up, with bay windows that looked out over a row of sycamores that turned gold in October and bare in November, and came back every spring like an argument she was always glad to lose. She had not moved when Callum started school, though a larger flat 2 streets over would have been more practical. She had not moved when her salary increased enough that she could have afforded something in Newlands or Giffnock. She had stayed because Callum's life was rooted in that postcode, and she had long ago stopped thinking of her own preferences as the priority. That is the first thing you need to understand about Margaret. She was not a saint. She was a pharmacist with a practical mind, a dry sense of humor, and a stubborn streak that her own mother had always called both her greatest strength and her most inconvenient quality. She was not the kind of woman who performed sacrifice. She simply performed it. Without announcement, without ledger, without the running total that the rest of us might have kept in the back of our minds. She had been keeping a different kind of running total for 18 years. Callum's asthma medication, Callum's school shoes, Callum's football training fees, Callum's biology tutor. You do not think of these things as line items when you are buying them. You think of them as Tuesday. You think of them as this is what needs doing, and I am the one who will do it. The receipts accumulate in files because you are a pharmacist and order is part of your professional DNA, not because you ever imagine needing them. Fiona McKinnon was Margaret's sister. 2 years younger, differently built in every way, softer in manner, quicker to charm, more comfortable in rooms full of people. She had always been the one who found it easier to walk into parties, easier to make people laugh, easier to let things go. Margaret had sometimes envied that looseness, that capacity to let the world's weight slide off her shoulders. What she had not known, until it became catastrophically clear, was that the weight Fiona was letting slide was not her own. It was other people's. It was Callum's. When the baby's father, a man named Stuart Aldridge who had been confident about wanting children until the moment they became real, left before Callum was born, Fiona had still seemed willing. She had been there for the birth. She had come home to the flat with the baby. She had sat on the sofa with him and said all the things that mothers say, looked at him the way mothers look, posted the photos on the Facebook profile she'd made earlier that year. And then, something shifted, over those 6 months. Something Margaret still does not fully understand, even now, because understanding it would require a kind of entry into her sister's mind that she has chosen not to attempt. On a Tuesday in September, when Callum was 6 months old, Fiona packed a bag. She said she needed time. She said she was not well in herself. She said Margaret was better at this than she was. And the awful thing, the thing that Margaret has turned over in her mind 1,000 times since, is that Fiona said it like it was a compliment. Like she was recognizing a talent. Like she was handing Margaret a gift. She was gone by noon. The first week was a kind of sustained practical emergency that left no room for the emotional reckoning that would come later. There were formulas to figure out, quantities she was not sure about, a small person who woke at 3 a.m. and needed warming and holding and who did not care at all that she was not his mother in any official sense. She slept in 4-hour intervals. She called the health visitor. She borrowed a pram from her neighbor Janet, a retired midwife who lived on the floor below and who appeared at the door the second morning with a casserole and no questions, and who became, in those early weeks, the closest thing Margaret had to a support network. Her own mother called twice that first week. The calls were tense in the way that calls between Margaret and her mother were always tense. Her mother had views, and her views were that this was not Margaret's responsibility, that the sensible thing was to contact social services, that Fiona would sort herself out eventually. Margaret had listened to this twice and then said, with the precision of someone who has made a decision and does not need it relitigated, that she had sorted it and would be in touch when there was news. Her mother had breathed the particular breath of a woman who disapproves but recognizes there is no point. They had not spoken again about it for 2 months. She told her colleagues at the pharmacy on the Monday morning of her second week off. She had called the dispensary manager, a quiet man named Robert who wore the same 3 shirts in rotation and had never once asked her a personal question in 6 years. She explained, in the neutral professional tone she used for complex dispensing queries, that she had acquired temporary guardianship of a 6-month-old and would need flexible hours for the foreseeable future. Robert had said he would look at the rota. He did not ask about the father. He did not ask about Fiona. He said, "Bring him in sometime, if you want," and then went back to the rota. And Margaret had felt, in an unexpected rush, the specific gratitude that comes when someone simply accepts a situation without needing it explained. The nights were hard in a different way from what she had expected. Not because of the waking. She had always been able to function on little sleep. But because of the silence in the hours after she had settled him back, the particular darkness of the flat with a child breathing in the small room and no other adult anywhere. She had been alone before. She had lived alone for 4 years before the baby's arrival. But this aloneness was different. It was the aloneness of someone who has taken on something enormous and cannot, at 3 a.m, share the weight with anyone. She did not dwell on it. She was not by nature a dweller. She made tea. She read. She planned. She was a pharmacist. She understood that the only way through a long treatment course was day by day. Margaret stood in the kitchen of that Shawlands flat holding a 6-month-old baby who was watching her with large dark eyes, and she made a calculation so fast it barely registered as a choice. She went to the phone and called the pharmacy to say she would need another week. She went to the kitchen and found the formula. She sat on the sofa and looked at Callum and said, out loud, "To no one and everyone." Well then, that's that. She had called him Callum because that was the name on his birth certificate, and she had decided early that no matter what else changed, his name would stay. It was the one thing his mother had given him that felt real, and Margaret was not in the business of taking things from children. She applied for legal guardianship at 7 months. She completed the adoption process when he was 2, in a room at the Sheriff Court in Glasgow, where a sheriff in reading glasses had asked her 3 questions and signed 2 documents and told her she was doing the right thing. She remembered everything about that room: the worn carpet, the strip lighting, the particular shade of wood on the desk. She had dressed up for it, worn a blue blouse she had bought specifically because she wanted to look like someone who understood the weight of what was being formalized. The adoption papers arrived in the post on a Thursday. She read them twice. Then she put them in a folder marked Callum, legal, and filed it in the cabinet in the bedroom, and went to make his lunch. You know, it occurs to me that most of us would have taken a photo of that moment, a milestone to mark. Margaret did not. She just put the folder in the cabinet. Because this was not a milestone to her, it was just the next thing that needed doing. Which, in its own way, is the most profound thing I can tell you about who this woman was. In those early years, Callum was a child of particular qualities that Margaret came to know the way you know the specific shape of something you have held every day. He was curious in a physical way, always touching, always investigating, the kind of small person who dismantled things to see how they worked, and then was puzzled when they didn't reassemble the same way. He was sensitive to atmosphere in rooms, noticing when adults were tense before adults noticed they were tense. He had a specific laugh, short, surprised, as if happiness had caught him off guard, that she heard in her mind sometimes even now, in its adult form, unchanged in quality. His first day at Shawlin's primary, he had held her hand very hard for the walk from the car, and then, at the gate, turned to look at her with an expression that she recognized as the one he would develop into his adult emotional idiom, composing himself, deciding to be all right, choosing confidence over fear. She had crouched to his level and said, "I'll be here at 3 o'clock. Not maybe, not probably." A statement of fact. He had looked at her for one more second, then turned and walked through the gate. She had watched him until he disappeared around the corner of the building, and then had stood for a moment in the September morning air before going back to her car and sitting there for a while, doing nothing in particular. The Christmases were their own tradition, assembled gradually from the wreckage of the family traditions that Fiona's absence had disrupted. They had a specific order: the stockings first, then breakfast with the radio on, then the tree gifts, then a long walk before dark. He had cried at 7, when the old cat that had come with the flat, a gray creature they called Biscuit with no very good reason, did not wake up one January morning. She had sat on the floor next to him with her hand on his back and let him cry without telling him to stop, or that it would be fine, and afterward he had looked at her with the slightly surprised expression of someone who has been given permission they hadn't expected. He didn't say thank you, but she had seen it. She had taught him to cook when he was 10, specifically because she believed that a person who could not feed themselves was a person at the mercy of the world. They had started with pasta sauce, the simplest version, tomatoes and garlic and patience, and moved from there through the years to roast chicken, to curries, to the shepherd's pie he had made for her on her 50th birthday, slightly burnt on one side, presented with a solemnity that she found both funny and moving. He was, when he put his mind to it, methodical in the kitchen. He had learned it from watching her. This was the kind of inheritance that did not appear in any document, but was as real as anything filed in a cabinet. The years that followed were ordinary in the way that only extraordinary commitment can be. She worked double shifts at the Royal Infirmary Pharmacy on the weekends so that she could pay the fees at Hutchison's Grammar School, which she had decided was where Callum was going because she had read the inspection reports and compared the university entry rates and made the decision the way she made all decisions, methodically, without sentiment, without anyone to consult. She did his reading with him every night until he could do it himself. She attended every parents' evening for 12 years, sitting across from teachers who always commented on how engaged she was, how thorough, how clearly invested, and she would nod and take notes and go home and adjust whatever needed adjusting. By the time he was a teenager, the easy years were behind them, but the interesting ones had begun. He went through the standard rebellions, a period at 15 when he spoke in monosyllables, a brief but alarming interest in a boy at school who Margaret judged, correctly as it turned out, to have a poor attitude toward consequences, a phase of listening to music through headphones at a volume she could hear from across the flat. She did not overreact to any of this. She observed, noted, kept open the lines of communication that she had built when he was young enough to still want them open, and waited. The boy with the poor attitude toward consequences lasted 3 months. The monosyllables gave way, gradually, to actual conversation once he had worked out whatever he needed to work out. The music settled into something she occasionally admitted she didn't entirely dislike. What mattered, in those teenage years, was a quality she had cultivated in him without ever naming it: the capacity to show up. For himself, first, to take his studying seriously, to follow through on commitments, to understand that the world did not adjust itself to accommodate unprepared people. For others, second, she had watched him, at 16, stay an extra hour after football training to help the younger players with something the coach had asked, when he could have left, and she had said nothing about it then but had thought, there it is. He was, she had understood by the time he was 17, a genuinely good person. Not perfect, not without blind spots. The wedding would demonstrate one of those, large and devastating. But in the essential matter of character, he was someone she would have chosen to know even if she hadn't been his mother. This, she thought, was the measure of it. Not that she loved him because he was hers, but that she would have admired him regardless. When he was 8 and broke his arm on the climbing frame at Lynn Park, she spent 11 hours in the A&E at the Southern General waiting to be seen, sitting on those plastic chairs in a waiting room that smelled of disinfectant and vending machine coffee, holding his small hand in both of hers and telling him stories about nothing. About a fox she'd once seen in the garden, about the time her own father's car had broken down on the air road, anything to keep his mind off the pain. She had never once thought, in those 11 hours, about anything except him. Not once. This is the setup you need to understand before we get to what happened at the Grand Central Hotel. Because the poisonous phrase, when it came, was not just an insult. It was the erasure of all of those 11 hours. All of those 12 years of parents' evenings. All of those early mornings and late nights and quiet Tuesdays when being his mother was simply the structure of her life. The wound, when it came, was made so much deeper by the height from which she fell. Act 2. Fiona resurfaced when Callum was 17. He had come home from school one Thursday afternoon and sat at the kitchen table with the particular posture that meant something was happening. Spine slightly curved, eyes not quite meeting hers, a kind of compressed waiting in him. Margaret had looked at him over the kettle and said, without preamble, "Whatever it is, just tell me." He told her. He'd had a friend request on Facebook from someone who said she was his birth mother, and he had accepted it, and they had exchanged messages, and she had asked to meet him. He had wanted to tell Margaret first. He was looking at her with those dark eyes she had known since he was 6 months old, and he was 17, and she could see that he needed her to say the right thing. She said, "That's your choice, love. I'll support whatever you decide." She meant it. She had always known this moment might come. She had prepared herself for it in the specific way that you prepare for things you cannot prevent, by understanding that her position as his mother was not threatened by Fiona's existence, only by what she did with it. So when he went to that first coffee meeting at a Cafe Nero on Buchanan Street, Margaret stayed home and read a novel and did not allow herself to catastrophize. What she did not anticipate was the story Fiona was building. The months that followed the first coffee meeting had a quality that Margaret recognized later as the phase of slow erosion, not dramatic shifts, nothing she could point to and say, "There, that is where it changed." Rather, a gradual accumulation of small things. Questions asked with a new edge, assumptions about what she knew and why she hadn't said. A quality to his silences on the phone that had not been there before. not the comfortable silences of two people who did not need to fill all the space, but the loaded silences of someone holding something back. She had not confronted it directly. She had instead done what she always did: observed, documented internally, waited. She had asked him once, on an evening in November, when he had come for dinner and been quieter than usual, whether everything was all right. He had said yes, things were fine. He had eaten his dinner. He had helped with the washing up. He had kissed her cheek at the door in the way he always had, and she had watched him walk to his car and told herself she was imagining things. She had not been imagining things. The conversation about the letters came in the spring, on the phone, at 11 in the morning. He had led into it carefully, with the technique of someone who has been coached. She would think this later, that there was a structure to it that was not entirely his. He said, "I've been talking to Fiona about some things." He said, "She's told me some things I didn't know." He said, "There were letters, Mum, and I don't understand why I never got them." She had held the phone very still against her ear. She had heard, in the distance, the sound of traffic on Pollockshaw's Road through the kitchen window she had left open. She had thought with the precision that shock sometimes produces, "I am going to need my phone records." She told him, in an even voice, that she had received no letters, that no one had sent letters, that there had been no contact from Fiona in any form until he was 17, and that she had the documentation to demonstrate this if he wanted to see it. There was a silence on the line. Then he said, "She seemed very sure." And Margaret had said, "I'm sure too." And then there was another silence, and he said he had to go, and he went. She had sat at the kitchen table after that call for 15 minutes, not crying, not in the first wave of shock, but thinking. She was thinking about the 2 Christmas card envelopes in her files, cards Fiona had sent to her, twice over those 17 years, with nothing for Callum. She was thinking about the phone records she had kept because she had a pharmacist's instinct for documentation. She was thinking that what had just happened was the beginning of something she had not anticipated and would need to address. She had filed the phone call under things that are relevant in the notebook that was beginning to fill. It came out slowly, over the months that followed, in small things Callum said, in questions he began asking, in a new quality to his silences when she tried to talk to him about his birth mother. Had she known Margaret? Why hadn't she reached out? Had there been letters? Had she passed them on? There had been no letters. Margaret knew this with the same certainty she knew her own name. But the lie was already planted. Fiona had told Callum, across those coffee dates and Facebook messages and carefully arranged lunch meetings, a story in which Margaret was not the hero. In Fiona's version, she had tried to stay in contact. She had written letters. She had sent money. She had asked for the address when they moved and been refused. She had been, in other words, a woman kept from her child by a possessive older sister who had always envied her ability to connect with people. It was a work of art, in its way. Because it was specific enough to feel real and vague enough to be impossible to disprove without the kind of documentation that most people would never think to produce. Letters that might have been lost in the post. Money that might have been deposited and not recorded. Phone calls that might not have been noted. Fiona had built her alibi out of the fog of unrecorded ordinary life. What Fiona had not accounted for was that Margaret Chen had documentation for practically everything, but that came later. First came the wedding. Callum announced his engagement to Emma Robertson in the spring of his 24th year. Emma was from Bearsden, the daughter of a structural engineer and a secondary school head teacher, a careful, kind woman with good handwriting and a genuine laugh who had, Margaret thought, more sense than most. She liked Emma. She liked that Emma made Callum steadier, that he seemed to think more before speaking since they'd been together, that he called more often when Emma was there. The wedding was set for September, the Grand Central Hotel on Gordon Street, 200 guests, the full production. Margaret had contributed to the $500 toward it because he was her son and she wanted to help, and because that was simply what she did. She wrote the check without condition or comment and handed it over and said, "Have a wonderful day, love." It was 3 weeks before the wedding when she received the invitation in the post. She had opened it at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with a cup of tea, expecting to feel the particular proud warmth that she had imagined she would feel. Seeing his name and Emma's name in formal print, seeing the date, the venue, the particular material confirmation that this life she had built was real and complete and present. And for approximately 4 seconds, before she found the seating card, she did feel it. Table 14. She had looked at that number for a long time. She had turned the card over, as if there might be a different number on the back. She had looked at the accompanying list that showed who was at each table. Table 1, the family table, Callum's new in-laws, and Fiona McKinnon, listed as mother of the groom. The corsage details were on a separate printed sheet. Both mothers, the sheet said, would be given matching corsages of white roses. Margaret had set the invitation down very carefully on the kitchen table. She had looked out the bay window at the sycamores on the street below. They were still in their summer leaves, green and dense, not yet touched by autumn. She had called Callum. The conversation had been brief because he had been busy, he'd said, and there was a wedding to manage. And yes, Fiona would be at table 1 because she was his mum, Margaret, and he needed her close. There had been a quality to his voice, defensive, slightly brittle, that she had heard before in difficult conversations and recognized as the sound of someone who knew they were doing something wrong but had committed to it. She had not argued. She had said, "I see." She had said she hoped he had a wonderful day. She had hung up and sat back down at the table and finished her tea. It was Fiona who then called her 2 days later to explain things in terms Margaret would understand. The phrase that came was delivered with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed it, who had anticipated this conversation and prepared her talking points. "You're still his aunt," Fiona said. "You've done wonderfully, but blood is blood, Margaret. Callum needs his real family now that he's starting his own." Real family. Those 2 words landed in Margaret's chest like stones dropped into still water. She felt the rings spreading outward, through her ribs, into her throat, cold in the tips of her fingers. She was aware of her breathing. She was aware of the silence in the flat around her, the particular silence of a home where someone has always been and is now gone. She said nothing to Fiona. She said she understood and she would see her at the wedding, and she put the phone down and stood in her kitchen for a long moment before she went to the sink and turned on the tap and let the cold water run over her wrists, because she needed something physical and present to anchor her. Real family. As if the 6,248 days she had been his legal parent were a hobby. As if the £47,000 she had spent on his education were a footnote. As if the woman who had walked out before he was able to sit up unassisted had more claim to the word mother than the woman who had taught him to read. She went to the wedding in her navy dress. She pinned on the white rose corsage. She sat at table 14, between Callum's old football coach, a decent man named Gordon Fraser who smelled of aftershave and seemed confused about why she wasn't at the family table, and a second cousin named Allison who was perfectly pleasant and had no idea there was anything unusual about the seating arrangement. Margaret ate the salmon starter and the beef main course, and drank 1 glass of the Chilean red, and watched, from the back of the room, everything that was happening at table 1. She watched Fiona accept congratulations. She watched the photographer arrange the family photos, Callum in the center with his arm around Emma on one side, and Fiona on the other, laughing at something Fiona had said. She was in one photograph. One, in the group shot that included the football coach and the distant cousins and various other people who occupied the category of people we feel we should invite. She smiled for the photograph because she was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her not smile. There was a particular cruelty to the waiting. The hours before the speeches were their own quiet ordeal. The polite small talk with Gordon Fraser about football results she had not followed. The smiles across tables. The champagne glass she kept refilling with water because she needed her mind clear. She watched Emma laughing with her bridesmaids on the other side of the room and felt the specific, uncomplicated warmth she had always felt toward Emma, a warmth that had nothing to do with the seating arrangement, that survived it, that would survive worse. Emma was a good person. Whatever was happening at Table 1 was not Emma's fault, and Margaret had made a private decision before she walked through the hotel door that she would not let any of this touch the way she felt about Emma. She did not look at Fiona more than was necessary. She noted with the detached observational quality she had cultivated during difficult shifts at the dispensary that Fiona was very good at accepting a room. She moved through the afternoon with the practiced ease of someone who belonged at the center of things, touching arms, laughing loudly at the right moments, positioning herself in photographs with the instinct of someone who had learned long ago how to occupy a narrative. Margaret watched this performance from Table 14 and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had been watching this performance her entire life. She had simply never before understood that she was the one paying for it. And then the speeches began. Callum stood at the microphone in his hired morning suit, and he was handsome and confident and 24 years old and already the best version of himself. And Margaret felt, even in that moment, the particular pride that does not care who is watching and cannot be taken away. She had done this specific human, standing in this specific ballroom, capable of this specific life, she had made this possible. He thanked Emma's parents. He thanked his friends. He thanked various people by name for various things. And then he paused, and his voice changed in the way that voices change when something important is coming. "I need to thank my real mother," he said. The microphone carried it to every corner of the room. The woman who gave me life and who came back into my world when I needed her most. Mum, Fiona, I love you. The applause was thunderous. At Table 14, Margaret's hands stayed in her lap. Her face did not move. She was aware of Gordon Fraser looking at her briefly from the corner of his eye, and then looking away. She was aware of the sound of 200 people clapping, and of the way the sound seemed to come from a great distance, as if she were listening through water. She was aware of the white rose corsage on her dress, and of the 47,000 pounds and the 11 hours in the A&E and the 14 drafts of the university personal statement. She looked at her hands, resting in her lap, and she thought, there it is. She did not cry. She had expected that she might, but she did not. What she felt was not exactly grief and not exactly anger. It was something more fundamental, a recognition. This is what erasure feels like from the inside. This is the specific sensation of being made to not exist. She sat through the rest of the evening with the precision of someone who has decided exactly how much of themselves they are willing to give. She stayed for the cake cutting. She said warm things to Emma when Emma hugged her, which Emma did with genuine warmth and an expression that suggested Emma, at least, was not entirely comfortable with the table arrangement. She spoke briefly with Callum during the dancing, and he was polite and slightly distant in the way that people are when they have not processed their own guilt. She left before the evening ended, taking her navy dress and her corsage and the 200 pounds she'd put in an envelope for them and walking to her car alone. She sat in the car park of the Grand Central Hotel in her 14-year-old Corsa for 23 minutes. She did not put the key in the ignition. She looked at the hotel entrance and the people moving in and out of it and the yellow light coming through the glass, and she thought about everything. About the Tuesday in September when Fiona had walked out, about the sheriff courtroom with the worn carpet, about the folder in her filing cabinet marked Callum, legal. And then she thought about the words real family, and she understood, with a clarity that only comes when you have been sitting in car parks long enough that she had a choice to make. She could absorb this. She could go home and pour herself a whiskey and decide that dignity meant silence, that demanding recognition was unseemly, that the best thing was to carry on being the woman who had always simply done what needed doing without complaint. or she could do something about it. The alternative, accepting this erasure, watching Fiona claim credit for 18 years of her sacrifice while sitting at table 1 with a mother of the groom corsage, that cost more than she was willing to pay. Some things you cannot let stand, even when fighting them hurts. Even when the person you are fighting for does not want to be fought for. She put the key in the ignition and drove home through the south side of Glasgow, the orange streetlights tracking her all the way back to Shawlands, and she did not feel sorry for herself. She felt, if anything, a kind of cold clarity, the kind that comes when you stop pretending and start planning. Act 3. The Tuesday morning decision happened exactly as she remembered it later. She woke at 6, earlier than usual, and lay in the darkness of her bedroom for a few minutes listening to the silence of the flat. The particular silence of a home that has held a child and no longer does. And then she got up, made tea, and went to her filing cabinet. She pulled out the folder marked Callum, Legal. She pulled out the receipts folder, the medical records folder, the school correspondence folder. She spread them across the kitchen table and she began to read. You know, most of us keep records in the vague, approximate way of people who assume things will never need to be proven. Margaret had kept records the way a pharmacist keeps records, cross-referenced, dated, labeled, filed in chronological order with dividers. She had not done this because she anticipated needing them. She had done it because this was simply how she organized her life. But now, looking at it spread across the kitchen table, she understood that what she was looking at was not just personal history. It was evidence. 6,248 days of legal parenthood. She counted backward from the day of his 18th birthday. She wrote the number at the top of a new page in a spiral-bound notebook she bought specifically for this purpose. She wrote down everything she could document. The school fees, £47,000 over 11 years, paid in installments by standing order from her account to Hutchison's, every major school trip, the dental bills. The orthodontist bills, Callum had needed braces for 2 years when he was 12, £3,240, paid in 12 monthly installments from her current account. The driving lessons, £1,200 to a BSM instructor in Newlands. The interview suit from Slater's, £340, and she had the receipt because she had put it on her credit card and still had the statement. The wedding contribution, £2,500, written as a check on the 12th of March of that year, and she had the counterfoil. When she totaled the documented expenses, and she was conservative, she did not include food or heating or the 10,000 small things that have no receipts. She arrived at a figure slightly in excess of £94,000. She looked at that number for a long time. £94,000. For a woman who had worked double shifts to pay school fees on a pharmacist's salary, who had driven a 14-year-old Corsa because a new car was not in the budget, who had last taken a holiday in 2015 because something had always come up when she'd planned one. She did not pursue 94,000. She had spoken to enough people by that point to understand what was realistic. But she wanted a solicitor's view, and so she called Diane Murray. Diane Murray had an office on West Nile Street, in one of those Glasgow city centre buildings that are sandstone on the outside and slightly cramped on the inside, a narrow staircase leading to a set of rooms that managed to be both professional and cluttered in the way of offices where real work gets done. She was in her mid-40s. With reading glasses she wore on a chain and a habit of removing them when she was about to say something important. Margaret arrived with 4 binders. She had labeled them clearly: Binder 1, Legal; Binder 2, Financial Records; Binder 3, Educational Documents; Binder 4, Medical and Correspondence. She set them on the desk in front of Diane and watched the solicitor open the first one. Diane read the adoption order from 2004. She read the school fee receipts. She looked at the bank statements. She was quiet for a long time. Then she took off her reading glasses and held them in one hand and looked at Margaret across the desk. "What exactly do you want?" she said. It was a good question, not because the answer was complicated, but because Margaret had spent the week since the wedding making sure she was clear about it, and being asked directly allowed her to be equally direct in return. "I want the money I'm owed," she said. "I supported him as his mother. Now he's an adult and considers someone else his mother. Fine, but I want compensation for 18 years of expenses that should have been shared." Fiona voluntarily relinquished her parental rights and responsibilities in 2004. She contributed nothing. She has recently received a significant inheritance. "I want formal acknowledgement that what I did had legal and financial weight." Diane replaced her glasses. "The legal basis is thin in Scottish family law for this exact scenario," she said. "It's not nothing, but it's not straightforward. The adoption order is very useful. It establishes that you had sole legal responsibility from age 2 to 18. That cuts both ways. It proves you were legally responsible, but it also means you took that responsibility on voluntarily. The argument you'd need to make is that Fiona's relinquishment of parental rights included an implicit financial obligation she never met." "Yee, can I make that argument?" "With this level of documentation?" Diane looked at the 4 binders again. "You can make it more convincingly than 90% of clients I see. The question is whether you want to go through family court to make it, or whether mediation might achieve something faster and with less—" She paused. "Collateral damage." The collateral damage was Callum. They both knew that. "Mediation first," Margaret said, "with agreement in advance that the ruling is binding. That's the right approach. I know a mediator who would be appropriate for this, Reverend MacLeod. He has a good reputation, and he takes financial obligations in family situations seriously." Here is what Margaret had learned. In the weeks between the wedding and that office on West Nile Street, from conversations with friends, from careful reading, from the particular education that comes when you stop grieving and start researching. Fiona had received a $90 inheritance from their mother's estate the previous year. Margaret had received nothing from that estate because her mother, a practical woman with conventional views about who deserved what, had left everything to Fiona on the grounds that Fiona was the one who had needed help. The irony was exquisite, and Margaret did not waste time being angry about it. She just noted it in her notebook under the heading "Things That Are Relevant." Fiona also had, according to family intelligence she had gathered carefully over the week since the wedding, been publicly claiming involvement in helping Callum and Emma buy their house in Giffnock. The house was a 285-00 Victorian terrace, a fine property. The deposit had come from Emma's parents. Fiona had contributed nothing and had still apparently accepted congratulations on her generosity. There was a pattern here that Margaret found not surprising, but clarifying. Fiona's great talent was accepting credit. She had been doing it her whole life. Margaret had watched it for decades. It had never previously cost her anything, because Margaret had never previously decided to make it cost something. She left West Nile Street with a folder of notes and a clarity of purpose that felt, she thought later, almost like relief. The decision was made. The process had begun, and for the first time since she'd sat in the car park of the Grand Central Hotel, she felt like herself again. The night before the mediation, Margaret sat at her kitchen table one more time with the 4 binders spread in front of her. She went through everything again, not because she needed to check facts, but because she needed to feel the weight of it. She needed to hold the evidence of those years and understand, in her body as well as her mind, what she was walking into that room to defend. She found, near the back of Binder 3, the letter she had written to Callum on his 18th birthday. She had kept a copy, characteristically. She read it now. It was not a sentimental letter. It was typically Margaret, direct, warm in a restrained way, full of specific details. She mentioned his asthma medication by name, a small joke they had between them. She mentioned the night he had come home from his first real heartbreak at 16, and they had sat up until 2 in the morning with mugs of tea, and she had told him about her own first heartbreak, and he had laughed despite himself. She mentioned that she was proud of him. She said it once near the end, without elaboration. She put the letter back in the binder. She was ready. The day of the mediation was a Tuesday in December. She had dressed carefully, a charcoal gray suit she had not worn since a job interview 4 years ago, well-made, soberly professional. She arrived 15 minutes early at Reverend McLeod's office in the West End and sat in the waiting room with her binders on her knees, and the kind of stillness that only comes from having decided, completely, what you are willing to do. The office was lined with books, floor to ceiling, on shelves that had been built specifically for the purpose. Canon law texts she recognized by their spines. Books on mediation, on family ethics, on grief and reconciliation. A tall window that looked out over the street, and through the window, the gray December sky over Glasgow's West End with its sandstone terraces and leafless trees. She heard them before she saw them. Fiona's voice, a register too bright, too warm. The particular performance of someone arriving for an occasion they intend to manage. And then behind her, quieter, unmistakable. Callum. Margaret had steeled herself for this. She had told herself in the mirror that morning while adjusting the collar of the charcoal suit that seeing him would be difficult, and she would hold herself together, and it would not change what she needed to do. What she had not entirely accounted for was the specific quality of pain that comes from seeing someone you love avoid your eyes. He looked at the floor when he came in. He looked at Reverend McLeod. He looked at the books on the shelves. And when he finally looked at her, briefly, what she saw in his face was not anger or contempt, but something worse. The particular expression of someone who knows they are in the wrong and has committed too far to admit it. She had seen that expression on a few faces in her life. She had never expected to see it on his. She said good morning to him. He said good morning back. Fiona said, "Margaret, this is unnecessary." And Margaret did not respond. Reverend McLeod began. He was a tall man in his late 60s, white-haired, with a face that had seen a great deal and absorbed most of it without judgment. He had a way of sitting very still that communicated authority without requiring volume. He explained the process. He noted that both parties had agreed in advance, in writing, to accept his ruling as binding. He asked if that was still the case. "Yes," Margaret said. A pause from Fiona's side of the table. Then, "Yes." "Good," said Reverend McLeod. "Let's begin." Act 4. Fiona spoke first. She had, Margaret noted, a talent for framing that bordered on the impressive. She was not lying. Exactly. She had simply constructed a version of events in which her choices made sense, in which her absence had been circumstantial, in which the Margaret who had raised Callum was not a hero, but a particularly organized babysitter who had somehow been allowed to formalize an arrangement that was always temporary. She spoke about reconnecting with Callum in warm terms, about the relationship they had rebuilt, about the importance of blood ties and the natural mother-child bond. She spoke about her own struggles during the years she was absent. Struggles that were real, Margaret knew, because she was not in the business of denying her sister's genuine difficulties, only in the business of being accurate about their relevance. Reverend McLeod listened without expression. He took notes. Then he turned to Margaret. She opened the first binder. "I adopted Callum in 2004, she said, after Fiona relinquished her parental rights. Here is the court order." She slid it across the table. Reverend McLeod picked it up and read it. Callum, across from her, watched the document travel across the table with the expression of someone watching something they had managed to almost forget become suddenly concrete. "I became his legal mother. Fiona ceased to have any claim, and ceased to have any recognized financial responsibility from that date. I accepted that arrangement. I fulfilled it." She opened Binder 2. I paid £47,000 for his education at Hutchison's Grammar School. Here are the payment records. She placed the stack of statements on the table. I paid for his medical care. I paid £3,240 for orthodontic treatment. I paid £1,200 for driving lessons. I paid £340 for his first job interview suit. I gave him £2,500 toward his wedding, a wedding at which I was seated at table 14, while Fiona wore a mother-of-the-groom corsage. She had rehearsed this part. She had considered whether to say the table number and had decided yes, because specificity was the only antidote to the vagueness Fiona was trading in. Fiona made a sound of protest, a half-word, and Reverend McLeod raised one hand fractionally and she stopped. Margaret continued, Fiona has told Callum that I kept her from him, that I withheld letters, that I kept maintenance money she sent, that I moved without giving her our address. These are fabrications. She paused for one beat. Here are my phone records for the 18 years in question. She opened Binder 4 to the phone records section. Show me one call from Fiona before Callum turned 17. One letter, one postmark, one bank transfer, one evidence of any attempt to reach him. The room was quiet. Fiona said nothing. Margaret slid one more document across the table. We lived in the same flat in Shawlands for 19 years. Our address was unchanged. Fiona knew it. She sent Christmas cards to that address twice. Here they are. Here are the envelopes with the postmarks. And both times there was nothing in them for Callum. Both times she wrote only to me. She knew the address. She simply chose not to use it. Reverend McLeod was reading the Christmas card envelopes, holding them close to the window light. Fiona spoke. Her voice was lower now, some of the performance gone out of it. I made mistakes, she said. I was not well. I was struggling. But I am his mother. You can't buy that. Margaret looked at her. She had been waiting for some version of this moment. She had thought about what she would say when it arrived, sitting at her kitchen table in the evenings in the weeks before this meeting. She had considered a dozen different responses. She had settled on the one that was most precisely true. You're right, she said, and her voice was quiet and steady, the voice of someone who has come to a position through evidence rather than emotion. You can't buy it. You build it. Day by day, year by year. I built it. You bought your way back in with coffee dates and Facebook posts once he was old enough that the hard work was done. No one spoke. She had not raised her voice. She had not needed to. The words occupied the room on their own weight. Callum's jaw tightened slightly. His eyes were down again. Reverend McLeod removed his reading glasses and set them on the table. He looked at Callum. Son, he said, I want to ask you 3 questions directly. I want honest answers, not the answers you think are expected. Callum looked up. Did Margaret care for you well? A breath. Yes. Did she sacrifice for you? The pause was longer this time. It was a different kind of pause from the previous one. Not the pause of someone deciding whether to answer, but the pause of someone feeling the answer arrive in them before their mouth could form it. Yes, he said. Do you believe you would be where you are today without her investment in your life? The longest pause yet. Margaret looked at her son across the mediation table, at the face she had watched change from infant to toddler, to boy to young man, at the particular quality of stillness that came over him when he was processing something real. She did not look away. No, he said. Just that. No. One syllable carrying 18 years of weight. Reverend McLeod nodded. He wrote something in his notes. Then he looked at Callum once more. Then she deserves recognition, son. Not erasure. Margaret felt something shift in the room at that moment. Not dramatic, not sudden. More like the almost imperceptible movement of a tide turning. Something that had been pressing in one direction for months began, slowly, to move the other way. Reverend McLeod sat with Callum's answer for a long moment. The room had a particular quality in those seconds. The books on the shelves, the gray December light through the tall window, the 4 binders on the table, the 4 people in the room, and the weight of what had just been acknowledged. Fiona was looking at her hands in her lap. Diane Murray was making a note with the careful neutrality of a professional who has learned that visible reactions are not her role. Callum had his elbows on the table and his hands together in front of him, in the posture she recognized as the one he took when he was thinking hard about something real. He was 24 years old, and he had just said, out loud, in a room full of witnesses, what he had known for some time and not allowed himself to say. She watched him working through it. She had always been able to read him. This was the particular intimacy of having known someone since they were 6 months old, having read their face through every developmental stage, having watched the emotions develop their adult vocabulary from the wordless raw materials of infancy. She could read the specific quality of what was moving through him now, and it was not what she had feared. It was not resentment or resistance or the hardened defensiveness she had seen in their phone calls. It was something softer and harder at the same time. The thing that happens when a person stops arguing with something they already know. Reverend McLeod asked Fiona whether she wished to respond to the documentary evidence. She said in a voice that had lost most of its performance quality, that she had made mistakes, and she knew that she was not trying to hurt Margaret, that she had genuinely believed she had tried to maintain contact. Margaret had heard these words and had recognized in them the particular human talent for constructing a self-justifying narrative so complete and so often rehearsed that it begins to feel like memory. She did not believe Fiona was lying in the simple, deliberate sense. She believed something more complicated and more corrosive, that Fiona had told the story so many times, had so thoroughly inhabited the version of events in which she was not the one who had abandoned her child, that the lie had become, for her, a kind of truth. She had said this to Diane Murray the week before, at a final prep meeting on West Nile Street. Diane had looked at her over the reading glasses and said, "That's a generous interpretation." And Margaret had said, "I know. But it doesn't change the documentation." The mediation session lasted 4 hours. There were more documents, more questions. A point halfway through where Fiona's solicitor tried an argument about the voluntary nature of the adoption that Diane Murray dispatched with quiet precision. There was a period where Callum sat very still and said almost nothing, and Margaret watched him sitting there and understood that something was happening in him that she could not control and was not supposed to control. He was reckoning with something. He was allowed to. She had not come here to win Callum. She had come here to correct the record. These were not the same thing, and knowing the difference was important. The formal ruling came 6 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, delivered by post in a manila envelope with the formal letterhead of the mediation service. Margaret opened it at the kitchen table, in the early light, with a cup of tea she had made, and then not drunk. Reverend James McLeod's ruling was 4 pages long. It was measured, careful, and unambiguous. Margaret Chen is Callum McKinnon's legal mother from the age of 2 to 18. The adoption order of 2004 is the operative legal document. Fiona McKinnon relinquished her parental role voluntarily and contributed nothing to the material upbringing of the child from 2004 to 2022. While the value of familial reconciliation is not in dispute, reconciliation does not retroactively erase legal and moral obligation. The financial evidence presented by Margaret Chen is documented, credible, and substantially undisputed. Fiona McKinnon is ordered to pay Margaret Chen the sum of $23,500, representing half of the documented expenses incurred in Callum McKinnon's upbringing, minus adjustments for the legal context of sole guardianship. This sum to be paid in full within 60 days. Additionally, Callum McKinnon is required to issue a written acknowledgement of Margaret Chen's role in raising him, to be shared with the same family members who attended the wedding reception. Margaret read the ruling twice. Then she folded it carefully, returned it to the envelope, and went to stand at the bay window, looking out at the sycamores on the street below. They were bare now, in the December cold, their branches making complicated patterns against the gray sky. She looked at them for a long time. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated in the way that she had sometimes, in her darker moments, imagined vindication might feel. What she felt was quieter than that and deeper. The specific sensation of a wrong that has been formally recognized, not undone, not forgotten, but recognized, written down, made part of the record. Justice, she thought, was a much less dramatic thing than people imagined it to be. It did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived in a manila envelope on a Thursday morning, and it said, in 4 careful pages, that what you did was real and it mattered, and here is the documentation to prove it. The financial impact on Fiona was severe in the way that financial impacts always are when they fall on money a person had already mentally spent. The $23,500 came from the inheritance, the money she had been planning to use for a kitchen renovation in her flat in Shawlands, a different flat from Margaret's Shawlands, a nicer one, purchased 2 years earlier with money that had come, as most of Fiona's money came, from other sources. Her solicitor's fees added another $6,800. The total loss was over £30,000, but the financial impact, in the end, was not the part that Fiona found most difficult to absorb. Callum's letter went out on a Friday, sent electronically to the same family distribution list that had received the wedding announcement. It was not long. He was not a man who wrote at length about personal matters. This was something Margaret had, in fact, taught him, by example, and by the way she herself communicated. Say what needs saying, no more. But what was in it was complete and unambiguous. He wrote that he wanted to correct the record. He wrote that his recent actions at his wedding had failed to honor the woman who had actually raised him. He wrote that Margaret Chen had given 18 years of daily, devoted, financially significant care to his upbringing, that he was the person he was today in large part because of her sacrifice, and that he had allowed other influences to cloud his judgment in a way that was both wrong and hurtful. He thanked her by name, in writing, for raising him with love and dedication. He used the word mother, not aunt, not family friend. Mother. Margaret did not know exactly what happened in the family and social circle that had attended the wedding when that letter arrived. She heard things, in the weeks that followed, from people who felt she had a right to know. She heard that people had begun asking Fiona uncomfortable questions. She heard that some of the guests who had applauded most enthusiastically at the speech were now reviewing their understanding of what they had been applauding. She heard that Callum and Emma had had significant conversations she was not privy to. She did not seek this information out. She did not need it. The social consequences, whatever they were Fiona's to navigate, and Margaret had no interest in navigation. She simply wanted to arrive somewhere solid, and she was there. What she noticed in the weeks after the ruling was that she did not feel the need to tell people about it. This surprised her. She had imagined that part of what she wanted was for people to know, for the world to understand what had been done to her and what she had done about it. But the ruling was not public. It was not broadcast, and she found that the knowledge of it, held privately, correctly, inside herself, was sufficient. The record had been corrected. That was what mattered, whether or not anyone was watching. This is the thing about Margaret that I most want you to understand. She had not done what she'd done for the audience. She had done it because some truths demand to be stated, even when the stating of them costs something, even when no one else will hear. The filing cabinet in her bedroom now contained not just the folder marked Callum, legal, but also the folder marked mediation, ruling, and somehow the existence of that second folder made the entire filing cabinet feel different. Complete, in a way it had not been before. Act 5. The first thing Margaret did with the money was book the trip to Vietnam. She had thought about Vietnam for years. Not obsessively. Not in the way of someone whose deferred dream had become a wound. But in the quiet, persistent way that a possibility you have earned lives in the back of your mind. She had looked up flights once in 2017, when Callum was 17, and she had thought, briefly, that she might go that summer. Then Fiona had reappeared, and the summer of 2017 had been consumed by something else entirely. She booked 3 weeks. Hanoi to Hoi An to Ho Chi Minh City, a route she had researched enough times to have it memorized. She used £8,000 of the settlement money, and she booked it with the particular pleasure of someone spending money they have rightfully won. The rest went into her pension, which had been underfunded for years by a series of decisions made on Callum's behalf. She did not think of this as making up for lost time exactly. She thought of it as completing the record. She went to Vietnam in late February, when Glasgow was at its coldest and grayest, and the sycamores on her street were still bare. She flew from Glasgow to Amsterdam to Hanoi, and she sat in the window seat and looked down at the clouds over the North Sea and felt, for the first time in what seemed like a very long time, entirely present in her own life. Not in the life she was maintaining for someone else, in her own. Hanoi was extraordinary. She had known it would be from the photographs, but photographs had not prepared her for the smell of it. The street food smoke and the exhaust and the particular green of the Hoan Kiem Lake early in the morning when the mist was still on it. She walked for hours each day. She ate at street stalls where she pointed at what other people were eating and was rewarded consistently. She sat in cafes and watched the city move around her, and she noted with a kind of quiet wonder, not thinking about anything in particular. This was new. This was what absence of a particular weight felt like. On the 4th morning in Hanoi, she had taken a cyclo through the old quarter before the city fully woke up. The streets were almost quiet. Almost because Hanoi was never entirely quiet. There was always a motorbike somewhere, always a vendor arranging their cart. And the light was that particular quality of early Southeast Asian morning that is more golden than gray. Different in every molecular quality from the Scottish light she had spent 52 years under. She had sat in the cyclo with her hands in her lap and watched the city pass on either side, and she had thought about almost nothing, which was, for Margaret Chen, a form of profound rest. She had written a journal for the 3 weeks. Not a particularly effusive journal. She was not a woman of effusive prose, but a record, because keeping records was as natural as breathing to her. She noted things that struck her. The specific preparation of bun cha at a restaurant where she was the only non-Vietnamese customer. The kindness of a woman at a silk shop in Hoi An who had spoken no English and had somehow communicated everything necessary through patience and gesture. The way the rain moved in from the sea at Hoi An in the late afternoon, and how she had sat on the covered balcony of her guest house and watched it with a glass of local beer and felt, fully and completely, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She thought about Callum sometimes, in Vietnam. Not in the heavy way of the months before, not the weight of unresolved grief, but more the way you think about something you care about that is at a sufficient distance to think about clearly. She thought about the letter he would eventually send her. She did not know yet that it was coming. She thought about it as a possibility, a thing she was holding space for but not forcing. The space itself felt good. For the first time in years, she was not trying to hold anything together. She was just traveling through a country she had wanted to see for a long time, on money she had rightfully won, in a life that was, piece by piece, coming back to her. She took photographs, which was unlike her. She sent a few to friends in Glasgow, who responded with appropriate enthusiasm. She did not send any to Callum, not because she did not want to, but because the timing was not right, and she understood, with the particular wisdom that comes from having held on long enough, that the right time would come on its own and could not be forced. It came 4 months after the ruling, on a Wednesday evening in April as a text message. "I want to talk." Not an explanation, not an apology, just those 3 words, and her name in the sender field. She sat with the message for a while. She thought about the 11 hours in the A&E. She thought about the phonics cards and the parents' evenings and the 14 drafts of the personal statement. She thought about the ruling in its manila envelope and the folder in the filing cabinet and the 3 weeks in Vietnam. She thought about the Hoan Kiem Lake in the morning mist. Then she typed, "Yes, call me whenever you're ready." He called on the Sunday. She had expected the conversation to be difficult, and it was, but not in the way she had braced for. It was not defensive or fractured or heavy with unspoken negotiation. It was, instead, the conversation of two people who had known each other for 24 years and were finding their way back to what they had always been. He said he was sorry. He said it directly, without qualification, which was, she understood, not an easy thing for him. She said she knew. She said she was glad he had called. She asked about Emma, who was well. She asked about the house in Giffnock, the boiler problem he had mentioned months ago before things went sideways. He laughed, that short, surprised laugh she had carried in her memory through all of it, and said the boiler was finally sorted and it had cost more than his first car. She told him about Vietnam. She told him about the cyclo through the old quarter, and the silk shop in Hoi An, and the woman who had communicated everything without sharing a single word. He listened. He asked questions. This was something she had taught him, she thought. The courtesy of asking questions, of being interested in answers. It was one of those small, invisible inheritances that don't appear on any document and cost nothing to pass on and mean everything to receive. They talked for 2 hours. When they said goodbye, he said he would call next Sunday. She said she would be here. And she would be, because she had always been, and she always would be. And that was the whole of it. The whole long story of what she was to him and what he was to her, lived out in the ordinary, reliable rhythm of a Sunday phone call that would go in no folder and require no documentation at all. Forgiveness is not a single act. It is a series of small ones, each of which requires choosing the person over the grievance, each of which is made more possible by what precedes it. What precedes it, in Margaret's case, was the formal recognition of what had been done to her. Without that, without the ruling and the letter and the correction of the record, she is not sure she could have opened the door at all. Not because she was not capable of forgiveness, she was, but because forgiveness offered from a position of ongoing injustice is not forgiveness. It is surrender. She had not surrendered. She had fought on her own terms through the systems available to her, with 4 binders of documentation and a sharp solicitor on West Nile Street, and a mediator with reading glasses who had asked 3 questions she would not forget. She had won what was real and achievable to win. And from that solid ground, she could choose what came next. She never spoke to Fiona again. There was nothing left to say. They had said what needed to be said in a room lined with books in the West End of Glasgow, and the record had been corrected, and she had no desire to continue a conversation that had concluded. Fiona was her sister by birth and a stranger by every other measure, and Margaret had learned over 52 years of life that the word family was not a debt you owed indefinitely to people who had spent those years confirming they were not owed it. The sycamores on her street came back in April, as they always did, with that particular explosion of green that felt, every spring, slightly miraculous. She walked under them on her way to work, and she noticed them, which she had not always done. She noticed a great deal more in the months after the ruling than she had noticed before. The quality of the afternoon light on the sandstone of the Shawlands buildings, the specific comfort of her kitchen in the evenings, the fact that she had, at 52, done something most people spend their whole lives avoiding. She had stood up and said, "This happened, it mattered, and I will not pretend otherwise." The filing cabinet in her bedroom now had 3 folders under C. Callum, legal, Callum, education, Callum, mediation. She thought sometimes about adding a 4th, Callum, future. But that was a folder she would let him fill. It would contain phone calls and eventually visits. It would contain the gradual, imperfect, Real process of two people who love each other working out how to be in each other's lives after something difficult. It would not be neat. It would not be filed in chronological order. That was fine. Not everything in a life needed to be documented. Some things you just have to live. And there is this, which I want you to sit with before we go. The academic literature on parental sacrifice and social recognition has consistently found that the most invisible labor in family systems is also, paradoxically, the most structurally significant. A 2021 study by family researchers at the University of Edinburgh identified what they termed the erasure paradox, the phenomenon whereby the parent who sacrifices the most is most likely to be taken for granted, because their sacrifice creates the stability that makes taking things for granted possible. You do not notice the foundation of a building. You live on the upper floors. Margaret Chen built the foundation. For 18 years, everything that Callum became was built on what she provided. His education, his health, his sense of himself as a person who could show up in a hired morning suit in a Grand Central Hotel ballroom and be confident and capable and loved. All of it was built on 47,000 pounds of school fees and 11 hours in the A&E and 14 drafts of a personal statement and 6,248 days of someone choosing, every single morning, to do what needed doing. Psychologists who study attachment note that children with stable primary caregivers consistently outperform those without in metrics ranging from educational attainment to emotional regulation to relationship quality. The stability itself is the gift, the invisible constancy of someone who will simply be there, who will pack the lunch and sign the form and sit in the waiting room and write the check and then do it again the next day and the next year. This gift does not come with a receipt, but Margaret, characteristically, kept the receipts anyway. What she taught us, and she would hate being put in this role. She would find it overdone. She would take off her reading glasses and give us a look, is that love is not made less real by being made legible. That demanding recognition for what you have given is not bitterness. That the systems available to us, the solicitors on West Nile Street, the mediators with their offices full of books, the family law processes that most of us hope we will never need, exist precisely for moments when informal agreements and family assumptions fail the people they were supposed to protect. Justice, it turned out, didn't require revenge. It just required receipts, and the willingness, when the moment demanded it, to open the filing cabinet and begin. There is one more thing. The sycamores on Margaret Street are still there. She still walks under them on her way to work, and she still notices them, the way she has noticed them since that spring after the ruling when she began, quite deliberately, to pay attention to the things she had been too busy to see. They are not a symbol of anything exactly. They are just trees that come back every year without being asked, without requiring recognition, without needing anyone to confirm that what they do is real. She finds this, on certain mornings, enormously comforting. If this story moved something in you, if you found yourself nodding or angry or quietly relieved at how it ended, tap the like button. It tells us you're here, and it means more than you know. Drop a comment below and tell us, what part of this hit hardest for you? And where are you watching from? It's always remarkable how far these stories travel. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit that button and the bell so you never miss what comes next. Speaking of what comes next, the story waiting for you on screen right now. I'm not going to tell you too much, except that it involves a will, a secret, and a moment of recognition in a hospital room that absolutely no one saw coming. Trust me, you are going to want to be there for it. We'll see you in the next one.